Welcome to the Garden Club show, the Pleasantville Garden Club. I'm Billie Jean Sorenesen, and our guest today is Trevor Hall.
Hello.
Bartlett Tree people, and welcome to our show.
Thank you.
We have a lot to talk about after this winter.
Yes.
First of all, Sandy. That was a bad news time. What were the results of that around Westchester?
It was a pretty significant storm, probably one of the most significant that we've ever dealt with because it was across the whole county, and it had a lot of different kinds of damage. It was a difficult storm because there was a long period of sustained, very high winds. We actually didn't have a lot of rain. A lot of times if we have a lot of rain in association with that wind, we have a lot of whole tree failures because the soil becomes saturated and it's easier to push the trees over. This was just a heavy wind, so we actually did have a large number of whole tree failures, which is people's worst fears and our worst fears, and
It's a nightmare because trees went through friends of ours' houses and down into their garages and ruined their cars. And
it did, and we saw all that, and at the same time, and trying to keep things sort of grounded in perspective. The vast majority of trees didn't. This is a portion of the county that's very well maintained by a lot of people have arborists. There's a lot of services around here, and for the most part, people do a good job of getting rid of the worst trees. And so, although we saw some bad things, we also recognize there's probably a lot of things that were avoided by preventative maintenance, trees that were pruned or that had decay and were removed prior to the storm, and so on and so forth. So, we're always trying to keep people from swinging too far the other way. After the storm, the phone's ringing that everybody wants to cut everything down. And
right.
A lot of the trees that went down, there was, usually when a tree fails, there is some reason for it. It's not just random. There's usually things like root decay or limited root space or cracks, or there are certain things that predispose trees.
Even if it's 100 feet tall.
Yeah, there are, and I think one of the scenarios that was hard was because as people drove around, there were a lot of trees on the side of the road that fell, and a lot of those trees, if you think about it, they fell away from the road, and they had limited roots under the road, so they were already operating on a very sort of compromised system. So, but it was the most visible thing that people saw. So we had a lot of trees suffer. It was different than the snowstorm the year before. The snowstorms are more of a pruning storm. There are limbs that break, whole trees don't fail. It's a better, if there is such a thing, it's a little bit better storm because people don't lose their plants, and people don't have severe damage in the same way. Usually this one, there wasn't a lot of restoration that we can do. Most of the damage was total. The plants weren't salvageable, so it was hard to see some of these things.
Yeah, I remember we drove over on Nanahagan one day and had to drive under a tree, which was above the car but across the road.
Yeah.
And I didn't find that very comforting.
No, it wasn't. But
and when we talked a little earlier, you did mention that there was some salt damage. I was really surprised because we're this far away from the ocean, but still it was a windy condition.
Well, and it wasn't evident. We didn't quite pick up on it right away because we were sort of so overwhelmed with cleaning up, the mess that was on the ground. But as things sort of leveled off, we realized that almost all the pines, not so much in this immediate area, but all along the coast, especially Long Island Sound, New Rochelle, up through Connecticut, and we're actually seeing it as far in as Yonkers and Scarsdale. The winds were so great that they picked up moisture and deposited it on these pine trees. And so we've got two things. We've got pines where when salt hits a plant, the salt pulls the water out of the cells. So you'll see pines that are brown, but then it's also in the soil. And so we're going to have a difficult time this year with with some of these plants. We're not exactly sure how they're going to do. Some of them are totally brown right now, but their buds are still green. So there are some things we can do with gypsum, and gypsum will bind up the salt in the soil. And then there are some things called surfactants that they bind up the salt, and then they'll pull it out of the soil and hopefully leave some of the other nutrients in there. So it's going to be an interesting thing. It was a damage that we hadn't seen in previous storms, but we hadn't had storms quite that severe. Even Irene wasn't as severe as Sandy.
I'm afraid we're going to see more of this with global warming prospects and with the glaciers melting and the sea rising.
Anecdotally, we've got more occurrences. We've had 2 significant hurricanes have an impact on us in the last 2 years. So, we have to at least pay some. We have to account for it.
How do you buy gypsum, for instance?
Well, you can get it at some like garden stores and so on and so forth. What we're recommending is if you have a plant that's browned out over this winter, the first thing we have to do is get a soil sample. When you pull a soil sample, you can tell the salt levels. So based on that would tell you the amounts of gypsum that you would apply.
And you would just put it around the trees, or?
You would put it into the soil and then water it in. If you have if you have a plant that just has, say, road salt damage, like you're along a road and you have road salt or salt's been piled up next to a plant, sort of the prescription, if you want to do something, is to drain, to really soak the soil, to try to purge the salt out of it. You do it like 1 week and then you wait a week and let it dry out and then do it another week. You don't want to drown the plant because that can lead to another set of problems, but you can purge salt out of your soils with just water. It's a little bit inexact, but if you have a small scale situation, you can do that for sure. But again, a soil sample helps. It tells you a lot of things, and Cornell does them, we do them. There's a couple of places you can go to get one done.
So while we're talking about Sandy, let's talk a little bit about winter and what one does in the winter. What activity goes on in the winter with tree people?
Well, with this winter, it's a lot of inspections. We obviously get calls after a storm like Sandy, and we address those things. But what we're trying to do now is to just inspect properties that we're familiar with, people that we've worked for, to try to make sure that we're not missing any of the subtle changes. If a tree has moved, sometimes it's very subtle. You might see the ground heave a little bit, or you might see just some slight changes around a plant. A homeowner may not notice it, especially during the winter. A lot of people leave at dark. They come home at dark. They're not in their yards. A lot of people won't go out until the spring, and then they'll notice it. So we're trying to catch things like that. The biggest sort of pest problems during the winter are deer and desiccation from winter winds, drying winds.
What do deer do?
They feed on pretty much anything that they can, especially if we have a lot of snow. There's no food for them in the forest right now because there's nothing green, and most plants have lost their leaves, so you get down to just a handful of plants that are green.
Rhododendron or something like that.
Yeah, rhododendrons, things like that. Arborvitaes, they love. So now is when people will find them feeding on their plants. So we spend some time, doing some treatments for those to try to deter them off of them.
How do you treat that?
There's a whole bunch of materials
Just
you can
use.
Just
ask at the nursery, or?
You can ask at the nursery, or, we have some ones that we like to use, and essentially they're either taste inhibitors or smell inhibitors that you try to, and they'll catch on to it. So it's an animal with a brain, and you're trying to interrupt its food source. So it's a little different than an insect. So they will adjust, and if eventually they figure out that smell is not really a threat, then they'll go after it. And then the winters when we do a lot of our pruning and cabling and things like that. What I was saying about the inspections, the winter is one of the best times because we can see totally through the plant. When it gets dense and leafed out, you can't always see things, and so it's a good time to get a good sense of what's going on.
Okay. I understand that the emerald ash borer is continuing to be a problem, and can you tell me a little bit about Westchester and what's going on with the borer?
Well, the borer's not technically in Westchester yet. It was first found in Detroit, Michigan in 2002. So it's only been identified for about 10 years. It's already taken down tens of millions of ash trees. They've had quarantines in states all across the country, from Michigan over to this way. 2 years ago, they found it in western New York. A year later, they found it in over in the Hudson Valley. Last year, they found it in Rockland and Orange. So now the state has what's a quarantine, and that means that there's 22 counties in the state, and it starts at northern Westchester and across the Tappan Zee Bridge. So what a quarantine means is you can't move ash trees, you can't move ash firewood, you can't move any ash products, and the fines are pretty substantial. And what the state and the federal government do is the main thing they're looking for is firewood. What they're most concerned about is that somebody goes to a campground, leaves Westchester with some ash. They have a dead ash. They have somebody come out, cuts it down. They don't know why it died. They just cut it down. They take the firewood. They go up to a campground in the Adirondacks. They just transported the beetles up there. So the fines are very, very serious. You know, the New York State DEC is the agency in charge of it, and
so that's the Department of Environmental Conservation.
And we anticipate that the quarantine is going to entail Westchester this year. Usually, usually when they find it in a place, they find that it's been there for 2 to 3 years because it just takes a little while to find it. So there are some treatments for it, and we've held off on any recommendation for treatment because it hasn't been close enough, but this year we think we're going to start to recommend treating it. The ashes in this area were already struggling, so there's not a lot of people that have a lot of prized ashes, but if they do, you know, the people who are really going to probably feel the pinch are the towns and the municipalities because they're responsible for trees, and if it gets here, they don't really have the budgets for you know, treating the trees, and they don't have the budgets for taking down large numbers of dead ash trees. So that's really been the stumbling block all across since this thing got here. Is and a lot of the ashes were planted to replace the elms that were lost to Dutch elm disease. So it's this cycle. You know, we have a lot of a species, and there's a problem. Then they replace them. And then there's another problem, and we sort of continue to put all of our eggs in one basket. And, you know, most people and plant people would say that diversity is the way around that. If you have a lot of different species, so like if instead of if there weren't so many ashes, it wouldn't be so devastating. But, you know, there's a lot of ashes between here and western New York, so it could be pretty devastating.
So to keep on top of that, people could call Bartlett Trees, they could probably call Cornell,
yeah.
And they could go to this website of New York State Department of Environmental Conservation.
Yeah,
Just Google that.
They have information about all of the invasive pests. I mean, because we have invasive plants, insects, diseases. It's a constant thing, and it's always changing. And so yeah, usually if we're inspecting a property, we're already looking at the ashes to make sure. But if you have ashes, you know you have ashes, then yeah, you probably want to have somebody at least take a look at them, determine if they're in good condition, and then, you know, give you a recommendation. Then you can weigh the benefits and, you know, negatives of trying to keep them or to not keep them. But it should, I think people are going to hear about it this year, similar to when Asian longhorn beetle became prevalent.
Big thing.
All of a sudden, everybody knew about Asian longhorn beetle. So this is going to be the thing over the next 2 years, I think. One of them.
I noticed in the literature that Bartlett has some kind of a patented root care program. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. Just as a general philosophy, I think we've really begun to focus on the fact that most plant problems and most plant health issues stem from below ground. It's one of these weird things where most people focus on the above ground portion of a plant, and that's sort of, is it green, is it yellow, does it look good, does it look bad, does it look like it's dying? And it's almost always related to the soil. And this is a suburban area, but it's also pretty urban. I mean, there's not a huge expanses there's not a lot of space that's undisturbed.
Exactly.
And so a lot of our soil profiles are not true soil profiles. They don't have all the natural organic matter that occurs in a forest, and the soils are compacted from foot traffic over the years and from building, and whenever there's new construction, they remove the best topsoil and then it gets compacted and then they put new topsoil down, and it's just not always a great thing. So what we are finding is that if you can improve the conditions of the soil through a couple ways, again, soil samples are critical to find out what is going on, to find out what nutrients are right, what the pH is, and then looking at sort of the makeup of the soil and how conducive it is to growing roots. We have, for years people have tilled their garden. You get a rototiller out there and you till up the soil and improve the pore space. Well, you can't do that under a tree because you chop up all the roots. So what the patent was for and is for is there's a device called an air spade, which was it's a device that's actually used to clear landmines. So it's a high pressure air gun. It's like a long tube that you squeeze the trigger and it releases air, but the air comes out very gentle, so it won't blow up a landmine, and it also won't damage a root. So we originally were using it to excavate the soil around the base of trees so we could get the root flares, which is, one of the main problems we have, is too much soil around the base. So then we realized there was an application where we're almost rototilling, similar to what you would do to your vegetable garden. And once you do that, you can add in organic matter and things. You can incorporate that into the soil, and you're trying to get back to replicating something similar to a forest, where it's this rich, it's like potting soil. You go and you put a house plant in this gorgeous soil, but then you look outside at your sugar maple and and you go out and you hit the ground and it's rock hard, and there's no, the grass that's there is getting all the nutrients and water before the tree roots do. And so just this, it's not just us, it's a lot of people. The shift has been towards looking at caring for trees and shrubs by starting at the ground. It's
soil
the foundation.
Soil is so critical to anything of gardening. And again, I think I would always encourage people to do composting. We don't put a leaf out in the street to be carried away. We use it all in the back of our garden, and we compost all of our
and it seems it's one of those things that seems so logical that people are looking at their sugar maple and it's got small leaves and the leaves are yellow and it seems to be dropping the leaves early in the spring. Well, it's under stress.
It needs nutrients.
And its natural means of doing that is it drops all of its sticks and leaves, and all those decompose and go back. But we take them all away every year. We rake them up and put them in the curb and send them to the landfill. And then we're like, well, why is our tree not looking well? And so the catch to that has always been, we've always fertilized, re-add the nutrients, but we'd like to take it a step further. We'd like to see if we can, sort of make the plants healthier from the basis, because then a lot of the insects and diseases that they get become less of an issue. If a plant is healthy and vigorous, if a tree is vigorous, it can get leaf disease for a season, and it's not the end of the world. You know, it's just a stress. If it's under stress all the time from poor growing conditions, poor soil, and poor nutrients, then all of those stresses, a drought, a storm, you know, cold winter, you know, a season of disease, you know, last year, the year before, we had just excessive rain, we had disease on everything. Those things are not as bad when the tree is growing well, when it has a good foundation to grow on. So that's been the way. And the patent you were talking about was that process of it. You can get a patent on a process. It's not a patent that's enforced or anything, but and it's called root invigoration. It's supposed to reinvigorate the plant, and it's a pretty cool thing.
Are ladybugs a big help in the garden, do you think?
They are, and that's, I think I was talking to you earlier. It sort of goes part and parcel with, you know, there's always trends and shifts, and as people are starting to focus more on the soil and more on that kind of thing, there's been, over the last decade or so, more of a push from the public, a demand to get better environmentally sound materials for treating insects and diseases and things like that. So over the last 5 years in particular, there's been a good proliferation of some real options. Previously, there were, all the options weren't great. They didn't give you consistent results. But now, because there's demand by the public, lady beetles, we have severe problems with mites in this area. Mites are a big problem, and now they've developed predaceous mites, mites that eat the good mites that eat the bad mites.
Oh, that's good.
And lady beetles and lacewings, and there's a whole slew of really good organic and natural materials that are working really well. So it's one of these things, there's been a shift, and it's come from the public. You know, a lot of, you know, industry, tree people, you know, they have stuff that works, and they want things that work. You know, they want, when somebody asks them to solve a problem, they want to be able to treat it with something that they know works. So I think this is a case where the public sort of brought, you know, everybody along a little bit.
Did we talk about boxwood? There's a boxwood blight.
Yeah, that I was going to say that after the emerald ash borer. That's the other big one, and again, boxwoods have become. One of my coworkers, his daughter is a landscape architect in Connecticut, and she said that 85% of their plant purchases in price, not 85% of the plants they purchase, but 85% of the cost is boxwoods. Boxwoods have become the plant of plants in this area because the deer don't eat them, and because they don't have a lot of pest problems. But because they're becoming close to a monoculture, they're now becoming very susceptible to some pests. Leaf miner has been a big one, mites have been a big one, and now there's a disease called boxwood blight, which is very devastating, and it could be a really big problem. I was telling you that I had somebody call me out who planted some infested plants. Their landscaper brought them in, and the new plants died quickly, and within a month they had killed a whole set of 40-year-old boxwoods in very short order. So it's a very aggressive disease, and it's not common. I've only seen it once I've only seen it once in Westchester, and Cornell has told me that they've had 3 other confirmed, you know, cases in Westchester. It's not an epidemic, but it has the potential to become a very big deal.
So keep looking at your boxwoods to be sure they're okay.
So the way you see it is the leaves get like a black spot. It almost looks like black paint. It's like a blotching. Or the whole exterior of the plant defoliates. The inside of the plant can still be green, but if all the tips are dropping all of their little boxwood leaves, then you got to get somebody out there. And there's a very specific protocol. You can't pull the plant out and throw it in your compost. You can't. You got to pull the plant out. You got to put it into a black plastic bag. It has to go to the landfill or some other means of disposal. And even your tools need to be disinfected. If you use a shovel to dig it out, the shovel, and then you go to the other side of the garden and dig with your shovel, you're going to transport it. It also affects Pachysandra. So this could be a big one. So we got our fingers crossed, but usually when it starts like this, it starts bad. So if anybody's doing landscaping this year and they're planting boxwoods, they should be asking if their plants have been inspected. They should be if they notice that it doesn't look great, you know, they should be bringing it up. They should be forcing the issue to get answers, make sure that it's not a problem, you know, and it's easy enough to get confirmation. They could take the plant, they could go down to Cornell Cooperative right down here in Valhalla. They could confirm it for you or say that it's something else.
I planted several of them this fall myself, so now I'm going to know to keep an eye on it.
Well, and again, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation should have information about that on their website. It's in this day and age, you can Google boxwood blight and you'll have everything you need to know.
Our time is running out, believe it or not, and I wanted to ask you one more thing. Tell me some trees that are useful to plant when you're landscaping a suburban garden. I ask that because in my house and a lot of others around, people planted some years ago spruce trees that are now 100 feet and a danger. What would you suggest? What are some of the trees that work well in a garden?
Yeah, that's
garden.
Like you're hitting on a tree guy's biggest, pet peeve. Because that is the case. A lot of people plant a row of Norway spruces as a hedge. Well, Norway spruces, that's the tree species that failed in Sandy. It was predominantly Norway spruces, and they were 60, 80 feet tall. That's how big they grow. So, and I think that there's a great place for large trees. We like big trees.
In the woods.
In the woods, but also if you have a space in your yard that doesn't have, you need to look not just at the ground, which is what people tend to do, but you have to look up and around. And if you have a place without power lines and, good space, you can plant an oak tree, a sugar maple, spruces.
But find out how big they're going to get.
Find out how big they're going to get. And ask those questions from whoever's making the recommendation, because in a very kind of pointed way, because they'll say, oh, it'll be fine. As far as plants, small plants, there's a lot of schools of thought. I was mentioning to you, there's a lot of people now that are leaning towards going towards the native plants because they have fewer pest problems. They're acclimated to this area. And there's a lot of good ones. Plants like service berries. They attract a lot of birds. They don't get very big. Some of the native dogwood is now available with disease resistance.
So in other words, do a lot of questioning and research before you start planting.
Yeah, and also I'm a big proponent of, maybe not rushing into it, and especially if you move to an area. If you can put off planting for a little bit, a year.
Good idea.
Go through the course of the year, and as you drive around, you'll see things that you're like, oh, that thing, the plant that blooms, what is that?
Yeah.
Ask, some people. Go to the gardens like Wave Hill on the Bronx and New York Botanical Gardens, and, just try to pick up some things that you like.
Very good.
I'm a big fan of the maples as well. So.
Okay, very good advice. I'm afraid our time is gone, but we've had a lot of really wonderful, useful information. So thank you so much for joining us today, Trevor.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching.